Chapter 1. Theo peered at the bustling streets of Deadwood Hollow, population 219 as his mom drove through. His dad's hometown had been built along the valley floor, in the middle of a dappled green forest that was, as far as Theo could tell, not dead at all. Theo had noticed a thick ring of fog outlining the town as the station wagon descended the mountains surrounding it. The fog had curled eerily around Mom's station wagon, clinging to it as they popped through just past the welcome sign. From a distance, Deadwood Hollow had seemed tiny compared to the wooded mountains. Now its sidewalks gleamed whitely under a blue sky and the mountains looked not much taller than downtown's 2- and 3-story buildings. And this was where he'd be spending the next 6 weeks. Theo rubbed a hand over the basketball in his lap. How much longer until we get to Grandma and Grandpa's house? A few more minutes. Look. Mom pointed toward the right. There's the theater. Your dad told me all about it. Guess they're still showing those creature feature matinees he used to watch when he was your age. Theo scrunched up his nose. What's a creature feature? Monster movies. Werewolves looks like. Theo glanced back out the window at the cinema as it rolled past. All of the buildings in the block shared walls, though each building had a different style. The businesses on either side of the cinema had sleek, modern fronts, painted in huge blocks of bright colors. The cinema looked like an ancient castle carved out of gray stone. Theo stared at it, awed by the columns forming a pointed arch around the entrance and the tower rising above that. On the roof, stone gargoyles sat on either side of the tower guarding it. The marquee above the entrance arch read the curse of the werewolf beside the time of the next showing. Mom turned a corner and the cinema slid out of sight. Theo faced forward in his seat and smiled. Werewolves. That sounded like fun. But if he told Mom that, she'd just say it was another thing for him to look forward to. Like no smog and no trash on the streets and neighbors who lived farther away than a wall. But that was their home in their city. This place was. Theo gazed at a woman pushing a baby carriage down the street, at the old people holding hands or playing chess in front of a general store, and tried not to sigh. This place was just weird. I can watch monster movies back home too, he said. His mom smiled and turned on the blinker. Yes, but in Deadwood Hollow you won't get mugged. This time Theo did sigh. Nothing got Mom down for long, not even sending him to live with Dad's parents for a whole summer while school was out. Because Mom worked weird hours as a nurse and Dad was stationed overseas, and Theo's brother Scotty held down 2 part-time jobs in between summer classes at the community college back home, which left no one to look after him. Theo patted his basketball. Sometimes being 11 sucked. Mom turned onto a side street, then turned again. A minute later she parked the car in front of a narrow 2-story blue house with flowers planted along the sidewalk. The house had a porch and rocking chairs and a small sign that read Hudson stuck in a bunch of purple pansies. It was just as ordinary and normal as any of the other houses they'd passed. Too normal. Nobody was that neat and tidy. Nobody back home anyway. Theo undid his seatbelt and slid out of the car, holding his basketball against one hip. He'd never been here before. Grandma and Grandpa had always come to the city for visits and stayed in Scotty's room. It's easier to move 2 people than 4, Mom said every Christmas when Grandma and Grandpa visited. Now that Theo thought about it, that was kind of weird too. He shrugged and followed Mom to the porch where his grandparents stood, smiling. Grandma held out her arms as she walked down the steps, and Theo let her hug him. She smelled nice like cookies and sunshine, and her hugs were squishy and warm. Well now, she said, and cupped his face in her hands. How's my Theo? Ready for a summer in the country? Theo's eyes went wide. Mom said you live in a small town. A small town in the country. I've got some sandwiches if you're hungry. Mom hugged Grandma. Thanks, Tessa, but we've already eaten. Grandpa stepped forward and smiled. Then I hope you saved room for dessert. Now that was more like it, Theo thought. Mom and Grandma went inside. Theo started to follow but stopped when Grandpa laid a hand on his shoulder. What's up? Theo said. Well, Grandpa said, you know what we're going to do now, right? Theo groaned and rolled his eyes. Talk. Grandpa smiled. Exactly. Why don't you go catch the matinee? The owners of the cinema have a son who's about your age. Theo glanced at the front door. Mom won't like that. Don't worry. I'll talk her into it. Do you need any money? Theo shook his head. No, sir. Mom let me bring my allowance and some money I made picking up trash and stuff. Good. Grandpa dug his wallet out of his pants and handed Theo a $5 bill. Here's a little extra for popcorn. See you back here in a couple of hours, okay? Theo looked at the door again. You sure Mom won't be mad? Grandpa bent down and looked Theo square in the eyes. Do you really want to spend the next 2 hours sitting still talking about grown-up stuff? No way. Theo stuck the money in his pocket and hopped down the stairs. Thanks, Grandpa, he called over his shoulder. Then he stepped onto the sidewalk and headed toward the movie. Chapter 2. Theo jogged across the street, then slowed to a walk, bouncing his basketball against the sidewalk. It made a tinny thunk each time it hit, just like back home. Maybe Deadwood Hollow wasn't so different from the city after all. A woman wearing exercise clothes jogged toward him, her ponytail bouncing. She smiled at him and said, Hey Theo, how are your grandparents? Fine thanks, he said as she passed. Great. Tell them I said hi. Sure. He turned around and watched her jog off. She hadn't told him her name. What? Was he supposed to tell the grands? Hey, some weird jogging lady told me to tell you hello? He shook his head and bounced the basketball again, then almost ran into a guy dressed like a mailman. Whoa there, the guy said, smiling. You must be Theo. How does everybody know my name? Theo blurted out. Small town. I'm Mr. Trodat. Got your mail covered 6 days a week. Theo scrunched up his nose. Don't you ever get a break? Mr. Trodat laughed. Sure, Theo. Every Sunday. Headed to the matinee. I don't think I'm supposed to tell a stranger where I'm going. I'm not a stranger. Why, I went to school with your father. How is he? Theo squinted his eyes at Mr. Trodat, trying to imagine him and Theo's dad being young enough to go to school. Fine, sir. He's still overseas. That's what your grandmother said. I sure hope your dad gets to come home soon. Me too, sir. Mr. Trodat shifted the mailbag slung over his shoulder. Well, best hop to it. See you around, Theo. Pleasure to meet you. You too, Theo said, but Mr. Trodat had already bustled off, whistling as he walked. Theo shook his head again. Nope, this wasn't like back home at all. He finally made it to the theater, after being stopped by nearly everybody he met, plus a few people who hollered hello to him from their front porches. The theater's lobby was cool and dim compared to outside. Old movie posters hung on the walls and ancient video games were tucked into the corners. The only person in there was a kid about Theo's age who was standing behind the snack counter and wearing a baseball cap backwards. Grandpa had said the cinema's owners had a son. Maybe this was him. Matinee? The kid said. Yeah. Theo glanced around, looking for the ticket kiosk. Where do I buy a ticket? The kid grinned and tapped his knuckles against the counter, like it was a set of drums. Right here, my man. We got your tickets, your popcorn, your soda, and a dozen different kinds of candy. Gummy worms. Absolutely. Can't have a monster mash without gummy worms. Popcorn. Sure, Theo said. Why not? It was a long time until supper and his stomach was grumbling, even though Mom had pulled off the interstate and bought them hamburgers before they got to Grandma and Grandpa's house. The kid fetched Theo's snacks. Theo handed over crumpled dollar bills, then tried to fit everything in his hands with a basketball. How about I carry some? The kid said. Dad will be out in a minute to take over and we can watch the movie together. Theo grinned. Yeah, sure. That'll be fun. I'm Theo. I know, the kid said, grinning. Let me guess. Small town. Got it in one. I'm Bay. My parents own the theater. Cool, Theo said. He followed Bay through a door under a sign that read the curse of the werewolf, then down the aisle toward the front. Only a few people had turned out for the movie. Some old people sat near the middle. 2 girls were by themselves, one with pigtails sitting on the front row, the other with long, curly hair sitting on the same side a couple of rows back. Bay led Theo to the front row opposite the girl with pigtails and helped him arrange the snacks and his basketball. I'll be back when the previews start, Bay said. Save a seat for me? Theo nearly groaned. Dude, how many more people do you think will be here? Bay grinned. You never know, man. As Bay walked away, Theo shook his head, then tried the popcorn. It was salty and buttery, just the way he liked it. Before he could get more than a few bites, the lights dimmed and the screen flickered with previews. Bay came in a minute later holding his own popcorn and drinks. Man, I cannot Wait to watch this with you. Normally I have to watch the matinees by myself. What about? Theo nodded toward the girls on the other side of the aisle. You know. Bay leaned close and lowered his voice. Dude, if I sit alone with a girl, she'll think I want to hold her hand or something. Theo wrinkled his nose. Ew. Exactly. The last preview ended and the opening credits came on. The lights dimmed. Until the room was pitch black except for the movie. Bay sank down in his seat next to Theo and smiled happily. Theo munched his popcorn, glad he'd let Grandpa talk him into seeing the matinee. Chapter 3. The opening credits faded into creepy music, leaving the shadow of a house surrounded by a dark forest on screen. The camera zoomed in on a car racing up the long driveway toward the house, then shifted to a wobbly close-up of a woman's terrified face. In the distance a howl sounded. The woman gasped and Theo grinned. Yeah, this was going to be good. Bay leaned close and said, this is a classic. One of my grandfather's favorites. How many times have you seen it? Theo said. About 100. Wow. Seeing the same movie 100 times? Sweet. The girl across the aisle, the one with pigtails, turned toward them and caught Theo's eye. She looked mad, probably because he and Bay had been talking. Sorry, Theo said. She sniffed and faced the movie. That's Jilly, Bay said, his voice so low Theo could barely hear him above. The movie? She's nice, I swear. Theo nodded. On screen, fog rolled in as the woman ran through the woods now, being chased by something off camera. A werewolf, maybe. It was all Theo could do not to bounce in his seat in anticipation. Bay shared a few tidbits about the movie and the actors. His grandfather, it turned out, had worked in a movie theater when he'd first moved to America. Theo couldn't wait to get that story out of his new friend. It sounded really interesting, a lot more interesting than anything else he'd heard since school let out and his mom dragged him here. Soon though, Bay's chatter tapered off and Theo became absorbed in the movie. So much so that when the full moon appeared suddenly halfway through, goose bumps popped out on his skin. The movie cut to the dark silhouette of a man, with the moon glowing above him and the surrounding forest. His body writhed through an agonizing transformation into a werewolf, limbs popping, claws sprouting from fingers. Hair inched out of skin and grew thick and coarse, and the man, now a werewolf, threw his head back and the hairs on the back of Theo's neck stood up. That howl had sounded really close. Too close, as a matter of fact. He sat up at the same time as Bay and looked around. The howl had sounded as if it had come from inside the theater. Suddenly the movie flickered and stopped and the projector cut out, plunging the room darkness. Emergency lights popped on, barely bright enough to see by. Oh, Bay said. It's not supposed to do that. I'd better get Dad. Someone in the back said. I'll get your father, Bay. Thanks, Mrs. Ellerby. Bay called. Theo said. Did that last howl sound kinda close to you? Yeah, it. Another howl erupted, sounding as if it had come from behind the screen, and Bay gulped. Kinda did. Theo's heart started pounding and he hunched his shoulders. That definitely had not been from the movie. There's no such thing as werewolves, right? He said. Ha, Bay said. No, of course not. Werewolves. Pish. You don't sound sure. Oh yeah, I'm sure, Bay said, sounding completely not sure. Jilly walked over to them. Did that howl come from inside the theater? Theo looked at Bay, Bay looked at Theo, and they both shrugged. Maybe we should investigate, Bay said. You know, go back there and look. Theo's eyes went wide. It's your family's theater. You go look. Don't be a ninny, Jilly snapped. No one's going to look because that's exactly how the trouble starts in every horror movie ever. Or were you too busy talking to notice that investigating the bad stuff always makes the bad stuff come after you? I said sorry, Theo muttered. Don't mind her, Bay said. She's just scared there might be a werewolf back there. Jilly's eyes narrowed and she stuck her fists on her hips. Oh please. Anybody's scared, it's you. Theo sighed. Well, now they had to go look. Bay had apparently figured that out too. He stood and said, come on. Theo set his basketball down on his seat. Then the three of them trudged toward the door to the right of the screen. Chapter 4. Backstage wasn't so scary. At least Theo thought it wasn't as he followed Bay and Jilly up a short flight of stairs into the room behind the screen. The emergency lights weren't much brighter than out in the theater, but he could halfway make out the shadowy lumps of objects sitting around the room. Bay flicked the light switches by the door several times. The room remained dark. He shrugged and said, "They used to do plays here sometimes back when my dad was a kid. There's lots of stuff left over from that. Costumes, makeup, some furniture." Jilly walked over to a nearby sofa and picked up a ratty teddy bear. She sneezed and dropped the toy. "Phew, that's dusty. Don't you guys ever clean back here?" "Sure," Bay said. "Once a year when we bring out the decorations for Halloween and Christmas." Something scratched the floor nearby and yipped. Theo's heart started pounding again and he sucked in a breath. "That sounded like a dog," he whispered. "Don't be silly," Jilly whispered back. "How could a dog get in here?" Bay's face twisted into a funny expression. "I don't know, Jilly. How could a werewolf howl during the movie?" "We don't know that it was a werewolf," she said primly. A shadow moved behind the sofa and feet pounded heavily on the floor. Jilly gasped and stepped back. Across the room, there came a screech and a thump, and a pale, vaguely human-shaped object slid sideways and clattered against the floor. "What was that?" Theo said. "It looked like a person." Jilly backed up another step. "Someone else is in here?" She sounded as scared as Theo felt. "No way," Bay said. "The back door is locked. The only other way into this room is through the door behind us." Theo resisted the urge to turn around and look at the door. He'd heard it close behind them when he came through. They were standing too close to the top of the stairs for anything to have snuck by them. "Well then," Jilly said. The overhead lights blinked on just then, interrupting whatever else she was going to say. "Come on," Bay said. "Let's check it out." "I'm telling you, this is when the bad stuff happens in the movies," Jilly muttered. Theo ignored her and followed Bay. The room wasn't so bad with the lights on. He matched the shadows he'd seen to more furniture and a clothes rack, and across the room where he'd seen the human-shaped thing, Bay walked over and picked up a mannequin. "Here's your bad guy, Theo. Dad got these from a department store that went out of business a while back." "Why?" Theo asked. "I mean, what use are mannequins to a movie theater?" Bay shrugged. "Beats me." A door squeaked open and banged shut nearby and they all jumped. Jilly pointed toward the other side of the stage, opposite where they'd come in. "That sounded like it came from over there." "That's where the outside door is," Bay said, but he looked puzzled. "It's supposed to be locked." He walked over and disappeared through a black curtain hanging from halfway up the far wall to the floor. Theo and Jilly looked at each other. He'd had enough adventure for one day. He was about to say so when the curtain shifted and Bay reappeared. "It's an easy exit," Bay said. "Locked from the outside but with a push bar on the inside so people can get out in an emergency." "So there was somebody back here," Jilly said. "Somebody," Theo said, remembering the shape of the moving shadow, "or some thing." Jilly's eyes went wide. "What's going on here?" "That's what I'd like to know," Bay said, only he sounded a lot more interested in finding out than Jilly did. The door leading into the theater opened, and an older woman appeared at the top of the stairs. "Your dad's got the projector fixed, Bay." "Thanks, Mrs. Ellerby." To Theo and Jilly he said, "Ready to watch the rest of the movie?" "Sure," Theo said. Jilly nodded, and they all went back into the theater and took seats on the front row. This time Jilly sat with them. As they were settling in with their snacks, Theo remembered the other girl who'd been sitting behind Jilly, the one with the curly hair. He looked around to see if she wanted to join them, but she disappeared. Probably went home when the projector broke, he thought, shrugging. The overhead lights faded. The movie picked up where it had left off and Theo dug into his gummy worms and popcorn. Chapter 5. When the movie ended, Bay asked Theo and Jilly if they wanted to hang out at his house until supper. "Maybe another day," Theo said. "I'd better get back to Grandma and Grandpa so I can say goodbye to Mom. She's going back home soon." Cool, Bay said. "We'll catch up this week." Theo grinned. "Sure. Thanks for hanging out with me." Bay grinned back. "You betcha." Theo said goodbye to him and Jilly threw his trash away and tucked his basketball under his arm. He waved at Mrs. Ellerby, even though he hadn't officially met her. It seemed like the kind of thing everybody did around here, and his grandparents would want him to be nice. He tried hard to do a good job being nice on the way back to their house and even remembered a few of the people he'd seen on his way to the theater. "How was the matinee?" someone called from their yard. "Was it as scary as I remember?" Theo turned and saw an older woman sitting on her porch. Probably, he said. Monster movies should always be scary, she said. He remembered how creepy the backstage area had been, with the shapes of furniture and things he couldn't really see and the shadow moving within the shadows. Whatever had been backstage with them, it sure had been in a hurry to leave. Yes, ma'am, he said at last, then waved and walked on. Mom was on the front porch with Grandma and Grandpa when Theo made it back. She smiled and held out her arm to him. We were on our way to the theater to say goodbye. He jogged up the steps and let her hug him. Sorry, the projector broke. We had to wait for Bay's dad to fix it. No worries then, Mom said. They brought in Theo's luggage. He hugged Mom again, then she got into her station wagon and drove away, waving as the car rolled down the street. Later, Grandma showed Theo his room. This was your dad's when he was little, she said. It was a very ordinary room. There was a small bed and a bookcase full of books and a window overlooking the street below. Faded posters of rock stars and athletes covered the wall behind the bed and dusty trophies crowded the top of the bookcase. Grandma left him there and went downstairs to the kitchen to start supper. Theo unpacked his suitcase into a small chest of drawers and the closet and decided to read one of his dad's old books. One without a single scary thing in it like werewolves or mannequins. After supper, Grandpa insisted on a game of Monopoly. Theo saw why when Grandpa won, but it was fun to sit and talk with them. Finally, Theo said goodnight and trudged upstairs to his dad's old room. Sure had been a long day. An exciting day. Was nice. Before he'd arrived, he'd been worried about not having anybody to hang out with that summer. Now he knew Bay and Jilly and had Saturday creature features to look forward to every week. They could hang out other times too. That sounded a lot more interesting than hanging out with his grandparents all the time. They didn't even own a TV. Just as he was turning off the overhead light, Theo's heart tripped into a patter that sounded like it had come from just outside the house. Quickly, he flipped off the light and hurried to the window. Outside, the sky was dark. Clouds drifted away from the full moon. Theo looked at it for a minute, admiring how big and bright it was. Something moved on the sidewalk below, catching his eye. He looked down and there on the street, in the mist slithering along the asphalt, stood a large, hairy person. It moved again and Theo's breath caught. No, not a person. A werewolf. It had a long snout and pointy teeth and ears and hands like claws, and it stood on two legs sniffing the air. Was this what they'd seen backstage after the projector broke? Was this what had howled at the movie's moon during the curse of the werewolf? The creature tilted its head and looked straight up at Theo. He jerked back from the window, his heart pounding. Had it seen him? Was it going to jump up here and gobble him up, or? Theo didn't know what werewolves did to kids, but he sure hoped it wasn't something bad. He especially hoped Grandpa had locked the house up tight so nothing could get in. His bedroom door opened and Grandpa poked his head in. Theo nearly jumped out of his skin. Talk about bad timing. Hey there, kiddo, Grandpa said. Everything okay up here? Sure. Everything's great. Everything except the werewolf walking down the street, Theo thought. Grandpa wiggled his mouth, making his gray mustache twitch. Need anything? Water or a snack or something? No, sir. I'm good. Thanks. Well, you know where to find us if you need us. Good night now. Good night, Grandpa. Grandpa shut the door, and Theo turned back to the window, steeling himself for what waited outside. A howl split the air, but it sounded farther away. Sure enough, when he looked outside, the only thing he saw was an ordinary guy jogging down the street. Theo started to open the window and warn the guy about the werewolf, then stop. Nobody would believe him about the werewolf, especially not some guy who didn't even know him. But he knew two people who would be interested in what he'd seen. Tomorrow, he'd try to figure out where Bay and Jilly lived so he could tell them what had happened. He took one more look outside, then climbed into bed. He reached for the bedside lamp to turn it off, then let his hand drop. It would be okay to leave the light on just this once, wouldn't it? Just in case, he thought. Then he closed his eyes and tried to sleep. Chapter 6. The next morning after breakfast and chores, Grandma asked Theo if he'd like to go to the local park to play with his friends. A lot of the neighborhood children go there on Sundays, she added. I'm sure your new friends will be there too. Theo perked up. Does it have a basketball court? It sure does. Theo pumped his fist in the air. Yes. Grandma laughed. I thought you might like that. There's just one rule and you must promise to obey it without question. What is it, Grandma? She placed her hands on his shoulders. Her eyes seemed very serious behind her glasses. You must promise to be back home before dark no matter what. Understand? Theo relaxed. Yes, ma'am. I can do that. Okay then. Let me pack you a lunch. A few minutes later, Theo had his basketball tucked under his arm and a lunchbox slung over his shoulder. Grandpa told him exactly how to get to the park, which was just a few blocks away. You can't miss it, he said. And if you do, backtrack here and we'll walk you over ourselves. Theo was absolutely 100% positive that showing up at the park with his grandparents would be just as embarrassing as his mom hugging him in front of all the kids at school. I've got it, he said. Don't forget to be back before dark, Grandma said. And stay out of the forest. Yes, ma'am. Theo hitched the lunchbox's strap over his shoulder and set off, happy to have the whole day free to play with his friends. Theo found the park on his first try. A dozen kids about his age and older were already there. Some sprawled on the grass to one side. A couple bounced a tennis ball back and forth on the lone tennis court. A few more stood around the half-size basketball court talking. It wasn't a huge park. The basketball court only had one goal and part of the grassy area was fenced off as a dog walking area. But there were trees all around the edges, and through the trees, the surface of a small lake glittered in the sunlight. Bay and Jilly broke away from the kids at the basketball court and came over to him. Hey man, Bay said, grinning. You're late. How can I be late if I didn't even know I was supposed to be here? Theo said. Jilly jerked a thumb at Bay. Logic. He has none. Bay ignored her. I did some digging last night and found something you're gonna love. Theo looked at Jilly. She rolled her eyes. It's comic books. Jilly. Dude. Bay adjusted his baseball cap, scowling. Don't spoil the surprise. I didn't tell him which comic book, did I? Okay. Man. Bay sighed. I left it at the house. So you coming or what? Theo looked around the park. You want me to walk away from a basketball court on a sunny day to go look at a comic book? Not just any comic book, Bay said. A collectible. Like that makes any difference. Jilly rolled her eyes again, then looked at Theo. You're going to want to see this. And besides, it's summer. The park isn't going anywhere. Yeah, but I might, Theo muttered. He was about to point out that it was his first time at the park when a shadow moving along the edge of the woods caught his eye. He did a double take. That had looked like a kid. The shadow moved deeper into the forest and disappeared, but the image stayed with him. For some reason it reminded him of the movie near the beginning. The woman's terrified eyes, clouds floating over the full moon, and the sound of a werewolf crashing through the trees. A chill ran down Theo's spine. Weird. Kind of like everything else he'd encountered in this crazy little town. Suddenly though, he didn't much feel like hanging out at the park. He sighed and turned back to his friends. Okay, lead on. Sweet, Bay said. Come on. My house is just a couple of blocks away. Like everything else in Deadwood Hollow, Theo thought as he followed Bay and Jilly out of the park. Chapter 7. Bay's house was behind the cinema his parents owned, hidden from view by businesses on one side and houses on the other three. It was narrow and tall, and a little crooked, as if it had been built out of blocks stacked by a toddler. Theo tilted his head back and counted 3 stories of crooked at least. Some house. The house was gray like the theater, only made of wood instead of stone. The most interesting thing about it though was the shutters bracketing the windows. Every single one was painted a different color. Bay stood beside him, his chest puffed out. So, what do you think? Amazing. Right. Oh yeah, Theo said. It's amazing all right. Jilly snorted, but Bay took off before she could say anything. Probably a good thing, considering her skeptical expression. On the other hand, Jilly always had a skeptical expression on her face. Theo shrugged and went inside and tried to keep up as Bay raced up narrow stairs to the 2nd floor and then the 3rd. They ended up in a tiny room, overlooking the theater's roof and the gargoyles guarding its tower. Sunlight streamed into the room through the lone window. Shelves filled with comic books lined the room's walls from floor to ceiling. More comic books were stacked in front of the shelves, leaving a thin winding trail from one side of the room to the other. Bay stood in the middle wearing a big grin. Some collection, huh? Theo managed a sincere, wow. It was my granddad's. He started reading comic books when he was a kid back in Vietnam, where his granddad was born, Jilly added, as if Theo could forget Bay telling him all that yesterday during the movie. Yeah, Bay said. That's how he learned to read English, from matching the words to the pictures. Some of those comic books were lost when he immigrated, but he collected a lot once he got a job here. In a movie theater, Theo remembered. He stepped up beside Bay and turned in a slow circle. This is amazing. How many are there? Lots. Dad knows exactly how many. You know, for insurance and stuff. Bay shrugged and plucked a comic book out of a pile near the window. But we're not here for any old comic book. Look. Bay held up the comic book he'd selected, and Theo and Jilly crowded around him to get a good look at it. The title read Werewolves Attack, in dripping red script next to a snarling werewolf crouched beneath a yellow full moon. My grandfather didn't just collect superhero comic books and such, Bay said. He had lots and lots of horror. After I got home from the matinee yesterday, I remembered this comic book. Took me a while to find it, but see here. This is what's important. Bay flipped the comic book open, muttering under his breath until he came to the right page. He flicked a finger against a panel showing a man with glasses, wearing a suit. The text above the man read, "For 3 nights the moon rises. Full." The next panel was a close-up. Sweat dripped down the man's face under the words. And every night the werewolf howls. Goosebumps broke out on Theo's skin. But the moon's only full for 1 night. Right. Technically, Jilly said, her voice shaking, the full moon happens in the blink of an eye. But it looks like it's full for the days before and after the official day. Bay thumped his fingertip against the comic book. Exactly. But that means, Theo swallowed hard. Guys, you won't believe this, but... Jilly glanced sharply at him. But what? I think I saw... He took a deep breath and spit it out all at once. I saw... werewolf last night. Bay pumped his fist in the air. Yes. Jilly sucked in a breath. Really? Where? We're not supposed to be out after dark. Like ever. Really? Theo shook the question off. They could talk about weird rules after they got finished discussing the werewolf. I was in my room. My dad's old room from when he was a kid. Jilly's expression fell. Oh. I heard a howl. Bay's eyebrows shot up. I heard that too. Me three, Jilly said. Then what? I looked outside and... Theo took another deep breath. There it was on the street outside my grandparents' house. Bay breathed out a long, wow. But that's not the creepy part, Theo said. It looked up at me. Jilly's eyes went wide. No way. Theo didn't want to admit that he'd gotten scared and hid, so he just nodded. Bay scowled at him. Man, I've lived in this town my whole life and never seen a werewolf. I wouldn't recommend it, Theo said. It was kinda scary. He described the werewolf to them, everything he could remember. The long snout, the way it moved, how hairy and strong it had looked. When Theo was finished, Bay let out a low whistle. And last night was just the first night. Theo's heart sank in his chest. Right. 2 more nights of the full moon. And that thing knows where I live. That's not the scary part, Theo, Jilly said. It knows where all of us live. What? Bay yelped. How could it? Jilly pointed at another panel in the comic book. In it, a snarling werewolf lifted its head as if it were sniffing the air. Theo shivered. He remembered that stance all too well. Werewolves have a great sense of smell, just like dogs, Jilly said. And if those howls we heard yesterday during the movie were a werewolf, then it knows what we smell like, Theo said. I bet it can track us wherever we go. Bay groaned and gripped the top of his head over his baseball cap, nearly dropping the comic book. Ah man, you mean it's going to come after us too? Jilly shrugged, but Theo could see how worried she was. He was worried too, and really glad Grandma had told him to be home before dark. That night, Theo watched Grandpa lock up the house before climbing the stairs to his dad's old room and getting ready for bed. He drew the curtains over the window so he wouldn't be tempted to look outside no matter what he heard. He'd had enough of werewolves for one lifetime. Still, when he heard a howl right outside his window, He clutched the covers. To his racing heartbeat. He'd watched Grandpa check the doors and windows. Couldn't get in the house. Unless it broke in. Theo closed his eyes, trying to block that thought out of his head. But once it occurred to him, that's all he could think about. The front door crumpling into splinters, the heavy thud of feet on the stairs, and those claws. He could almost feel the werewolf's breath on his cheek. The werewolf howled again, startling Theo so badly he jumped. The thoughts of what might happen if the werewolf broke down the door flew out of his head. Man, when had his imagination gotten so vivid? His shaky laugh did nothing to ease his mind or calm his heartbeat. The howl sounded a third time farther off, and Theo relaxed under the covers. Safe for one night probably. Only one more to go, then the full moon would have passed. And they wouldn't have to worry about werewolves roaming the nighttime streets. For another month. Still uneasy, Theo closed his eyes and fell into a restless sleep. Chapter 8. The next day, Theo and his grandparents walked the 2 blocks to Main Street. For lunch. We do this every Monday, Grandma said. Like clockwork, Grandpa added. Have since we retired. Theo scrunched his nose up. Every single Monday? Oh my yes, Grandma said. Why, people would wonder what happened to us if we didn't go. Lots of folks there, especially in the summer. Grandpa waved at some older people sitting on their porches. I'm sure your friends will be there too. Grandma patted Theo's shoulder. Of course they will, dear. Jilly's mother is the town's pharmacist. Theo tried, but he couldn't make the connection between Jilly's mom and lunch. Downtown. What? The pharmacy has a lunch counter. Grandpa winked at him. Best chicken salad sandwich in the valley. Good burgers too. The pharmacy was on the next block down from the cinema, in a section of Main Street Theo hadn't seen yet. 4 round metal tables sat on the sidewalk in front of a huge plate glass window reading Deadwood Hollow Pharmacy in curling script. 3 of the tables were full. As Theo followed his grandparents into the pharmacy, a man and a woman in business clothes came out, carrying their lunches, and seated themselves at the 4th table. Inside, people milled around the left-hand side of the pharmacy shopping. Along the neatly stocked aisles, a cashier rang people out behind a counter next to the entrance. In the back on the left was a window where people were lined up waiting to talk to a woman wearing a white coat. The lunch counter and another 4 tables full of people eating were to the right of that. Jilly sat at the lunch counter, doodling in a notebook between bites of a BLT. He recognized a few other people too from his walks around town. What interested him most, though, were 2 people sitting on the opposite end of the L-shaped counter. Mr. Traudat, the postman, and the curly-haired girl who'd been at the matinee. She was wearing a dress again similar to the one she'd worn at the movies, and was eating as if she were at a palace instead of a pharmacy in the middle of nowhere. Grandma excused herself to go pick up a prescription, telling Grandpa to order her usual. Theo quickly looked over the menu tacked behind the counter, above the cook station, then tried not to fidget while they waited for the family in front of them to order. Grandpa looked down and his mustache twitched over a smile. Antsy? No, sir. Not exactly, Theo thought. That's my friend Jilly. Tell you what. I'll order for you if you want to go ahead and talk to her. Theo grinned. That would be great. Thanks. He rattled off his order. Cheeseburger and fries with a strawberry milkshake. Then politely walked around people and tables to the counter. Jilly was just finishing the last of her French fries. Her eyebrows rose as he slid into the empty stool beside her, and she flipped her notebook shut. Did you hear it last night? He whispered. She nodded as she chewed and swallowed. Yeah. Creepy, wasn't it? It was creepy just thinking about it. Hearing it had been terrifying. Theo gulped. It sounded like it was right outside my window again. Mine too. Jilly looked around nervously, then leaned closer and lowered her voice. It didn't get that close the night before. It's got to be following us. If it is. A ruckus interrupted their conversation, and they both looked around. The curly-haired girl stood at the other end of the counter, staring down at the floor, her face crumpling into tears. Mr. Traudat was kneeling in front of her, cleaning something up. I'm sorry, Dad, the girl said. It slipped out of my hands. That's okay, honey, he said. Accidents happen. Theo looked at Jilly, his eyebrows raised. Winifred Traudat, she whispered, then mouthed later to him. We'll need to find a table soon, unless you want to sit at the counter. Theo glanced around and saw Mr. Trodat and Winifred leaving. The man who'd been sitting beside them looked close to being finished, too. Theo pointed to that end of the counter. Maybe we can sit there? Good idea, Grandpa said. Better grab it before the second lunch wave starts. Don't talk too long, Theo. Yes, sir. As soon as Grandpa was out of earshot, Theo turned back to Jilly. Spill it. There's not much to spill, Jilly admitted. Winnie is shy. Her parents homeschool her and she doesn't participate in many activities. That's kinda sad. Jilly shrugged. I think she likes it. Bet she gets lonely though. Maybe sometimes. Jilly lowered her eyes and poked at the empty paper basket. Her lunch had come in. Everybody gets lonely sometimes. Yeah. Still, it must be hard on Winnie, living in such a small town and being homeschooled. A double whammy in Theo's mind. For a minute he wondered if she had any friends or if she needed any. On the spot, he vowed to ask her to sit with him, Bay, and Jilly if she showed up at the matinee next Saturday. Assuming they all survived the last night of the full moon. Grandma bustled over and shooed him to the other end of the lunch counter. Theo said goodbye to Jilly on a promise to meet up later. Then he sat down with his grandparents and listened to them talk while eating his cheeseburger. When they were back at his grandparents' house, Theo said, So, I met Mr. Trodat the other day. He said he's the postman. That's right, dear, Grandma said. And that's his daughter Winnie? Grandpa paused in the middle of picking out a new book from the stack by his favorite chair and his mustache twitched downward. Quickly Theo rushed on. I saw her at the matinee the other day but we didn't get to talk. I wondered if maybe I could go by her house and invite her to play with me and Bay and Jilly someday, if you know where she lives. Grandma and Grandpa shared a long look, then Grandma said gently, We don't intrude in people's homes without an invitation, Theo. Theo's shoulders sagged. Oh, sorry. I was just trying to be nice. I know, dear. Besides, Grandpa said, the Tradats live on the outskirts of town. Probably too far for you to walk. Certainly not on your own, what with it being so close to the forest's boundaries. Grandma shot a worried glance at Grandpa. At any rate you'll be busy enough getting to know the two friends you already have, yes? Yes, ma'am, Theo said, but he was puzzled. What was wrong with having 3 friends? Mom always said the more the merrier. But maybe that was another weird Deadwood Hollow thing. Maybe here, kids could only have so many friends at a time. Sighing, Theo said, Is it okay if I go over to Bay's? He's showing me and Jilly his grandfather's comic book collection. Grandma's expression brightened. Oh, did they keep that? What a delight. Grandpa chose a book and settled into his favorite chair. I remember those. Glad they held on to them. They're pretty interesting, Theo admitted. Especially the one about the werewolf, though he wasn't telling his grandparents that. What they didn't know wouldn't hurt them. Probably. Go along then, dear, Grandma said. And have a good time. Remember to be back before dark. Yes, ma'am. I will. Theo ran upstairs and grabbed his basketball, then promised again as he left. Just so they'd maybe forget how nosy he'd been about Winnie. Chapter 9. Bay's mom let Theo in and invited him to go on up. Bay's in his grandfather's room, she said. Jilly's already up there with him. Theo thanked her and raced up the 2 flights of stairs to the comic book room where he knew Bay would be. When he got there, Bay and Jilly were sitting in the middle of the floor, reading a comic book together. They looked up as Theo entered. Slowpoke, Jilly said. Got here as soon as I could. He set his basketball down against a stack of comic books where it wouldn't roll away, and plopped down beside them. Another werewolf comic? Same one, Bay said. It's got so much good info in it. Theo raised his eyebrows at Jilly. How to kill them, she said. Which we are not going to do. Hey now, Bay said. I said I wanted to capture it, not kill it. Jilly. We're just kids. Yeah, Theo agreed. I don't want to kill anything. Even the scary werewolf that had been howling outside his window for 2 nights straight. On the other hand, is there anything in there about how to keep it from following you? Theo asked hopefully. Not a word, Jilly said. Bay grinned. But there's a way of capturing it. And if we can get it out of the moonlight, we might be able to figure out who it is. Wow, Theo said. Really? It wasn't something he'd even considered before, and he wasn't sure why. Seemed obvious now. Werewolves took human forms except during the full moon. In a town this size there was a good chance Bay and Jilly knew the werewolf. As a human. Talk about awkward. So, Theo said. Any idea who the werewolf is? Bay shook his head. That's why we're going to capture it. Theo didn't like the way his friend said that, as if Bay were happy to be chasing after a creature with claw-tipped fingers and a mouth full of sharp teeth. Could probably run faster than them too, being part wolf. $10. Bay hadn't figured that into whatever plan he was cooking up. Are you sure that's a good idea? Theo said. I think it's a really bad idea, Jilly said firmly. But if we don't go along with it, Peas for Brains here will try to do it on his own. Hey, Bay said. I resemble that remark. Theo snorted out a laugh, but Jilly just plowed ahead. It's not such a bad plan. She took the comic book from Bay and gently turned the pages. Assuming this thing is right. Look, it lays out everything we need to do, almost like a guidebook. Theo craned his neck so he could see what she was talking about. It says we need bait. What kind? What kind do you think? Jilly said sharply. A human. Bay just grinned. More specifically me. No way, Theo said. Way dude, Bay replied. I've got it all figured out. I'm the bait because I'm the slowest. That means you and Jilly can corner it and take care of business. Jilly looked as skeptical as Theo felt. That's not the bad part. Tell him the rest, Bay. Like when you plan on doing this. For the first time since Theo had entered the room, Bay looked uncertain. Yeah, about that. We have to wait until the werewolf transforms, which means waiting until the moon rises. It took Theo about 2 seconds to grasp his meaning. You mean after dark? Jilly nodded and closed the comic book. That's exactly what he means. My parents only have 2 rules I really have to follow, and one is be home before dark, Theo muttered. Yeah, Bay said glumly. I've never been outside at night without them. Like, ever. Me neither, Jilly said. Theo glanced between them. He'd been outside at night alone, but that was back in the city where he lived. There, he knew the neighborhood and the people. He knew when to hide and how to avoid trouble. Here he was way out of his league. I don't think this is a good idea, he said quietly. I don't want to get in trouble with my grandparents. But how are we going to figure out who it is? Bay said. Jilly shook her head impatiently. It's not something we really have to know. Is too. Bay sounded determined now. Worse, he looked determined. So I'm going out whether you 2 go with me or not. Theo glanced at Jilly. She rolled her eyes and said, okay, fine. I'm in. But if I get in trouble for this, I'm taking it out on you. Gotcha. Bay looked at Theo and held out his hand. You in or what? Don't leave me hanging, man. When he put it like that, there wasn't much of an option. Theo nodded and slapped his hand into Bay's. I'm in, but what Jilly said. I get into trouble, you're helping me get out of it. Deal, Bay said, nodding firmly. I've got it all figured out. Here's what we're going to do. Theo and Jilly huddled around him and listened as Bay quietly laid out a very simple plan for capturing Deadwood Hollow's very own werewolf. Chapter 10. That night, Theo lay on his dad's twin bed in the dark, waiting impatiently for his grandparents to go to bed. Their bedtime was an hour after his. When Bay was explaining his plan, Theo thought he'd have a hard time staying awake long enough to sneak out. He hadn't realized that he'd be so nervous and scared he couldn't sleep. Finally, Theo heard Grandma's footsteps in the hallway outside his room, then Grandpa's. The hallway light cut off and their bedroom door shut. He slowly counted off the minutes ticking by on his dad's old alarm clock. 2 minutes. 3. 5. After 10 minutes had passed, Theo eased off the bed, picked up his shoes and the flashlight he'd found in Dad's closet, and tiptoed to the door. The house was quiet as far as he could tell. Slowly he eased the door open and stepped into the hallway. Grandma's voice drifted through his grandparents' bedroom door. Trouble with that girl, she said. Theo's heart leapt into his throat. He froze with his hand still on his bedroom door's doorknob. What trouble were they talking about? What girl? Now Tessa, Grandpa said. Sufficient unto each day are the troubles thereof. Well, you know what she is, Dorn, and Theo showing an interest too. Theo perked up at that. What girl had he shown an interest in? The only girl he knew here was Jilly, and they were just friends. It's not like he wanted to hold her hand or anything, though he was kind of hoping they could play basketball one day when Bay didn't have them chasing after werewolves in the middle of the night. Maybe, Grandma continued slowly, maybe it was a mistake to bring him here. Where else would he have gone? Grandpa said. The boy needs us now and we need him. There's the covenant to consider, after all. Yes, of course. The covenant. Theo shook his head and quietly shut his door. Grandparents sure talked about weird stuff, he thought as he padded silently across the hallway and down the steps. What was a covenant anyway, and what did it have to do with him? Whatever it was, Grandma hadn't sounded happy about it. Hopefully it wasn't anything bad. As soon as he was in the kitchen, Theo slipped on his shoes and snuck out the back door, carefully closing it behind him. A thick mist curled along the grass. Overhead, the moon rose full and yellow in a clear patch of the cloudy night sky. Insects chirped loudly. Theo couldn't tell what kind and didn't want to know. Crickets, maybe? He shrugged. Yet another difference between Deadwood Hollow and back home. At least the werewolf wasn't howling again. He took a deep breath and, with as much courage as he could gather, walked around the side of the house. The street in front of Grandma and Grandpa's house was empty except for that weird mist. Theo had half expected to see the werewolf, but as far as he could tell, no one was around. No cars, no joggers. Nobody was out at all. That had never happened back home. Mom said the city never slept. Deadwood Hollow seemed to go to sleep as soon as the sun went down. Theo stepped onto the sidewalk and jogged across the street, following the sidewalks. Mist whirled around his legs so thick he nearly tripped over the rise of the opposite sidewalk. Darkened houses solemnly guarded his path. Their windows shuddered against the moonlight. An owl hooted in the distance, and a chill shuddered down Theo's spine. Even the stars seemed to be hiding tonight. Not the moon, though. It glowed fiercely, making the clouds around it seem even more ominous. Theo shuddered and picked up his pace. Bay figured werewolves were just like real wolves. They liked the woods. The park sure had enough trees. And there was the forest surrounding the town too, so maybe Bay was right. Maybe the werewolf being in town was just a fluke. Like maybe it had gotten turned around on its way home or something. Theo snorted as he crossed the final street and walked toward the park. Yeah, right. That was about as likely as him getting turned around on his way home. It was impossible to get lost in a town as small as Deadwood Hollow. Jilly was already waiting, sitting in the pitch-dark shadows of a huge pine, behind a patch of grass. When she saw him, she stood, brushed off the seat of her shorts, and stepped into the moonlight. When Theo reached her, he whispered, "Where's Bay?" "I don't know," Jilly whispered. "He's running late." "Here I am," Bay called breathlessly. Theo turned and spotted his friend jogging toward them carrying a plastic grocery bag. Bay's smile was so big it must have hurt his cheeks. If Theo had learned anything about the other boy in the past few days, it was that Bay loved a wacky adventure. Trying to capture a werewolf sure fit that bill. Bay stopped beside them, panting. "I brought hamburgers. Dad cooked out tonight." Theo said. "For us." Jilly elbowed him in the ribs. "For the werewolf, silly." "Oh, right. More bait," Bay said. "Just in case." "As if you weren't enough," Jilly muttered. Something crashed through the woods and they all froze. "Is that it?" Theo whispered. "Nah," Bay said shakily. "That's just." Suddenly, the werewolf burst through the tree line, snarling. Saliva dripped from its teeth and its claws gleamed wickedly in the moonlight. "Run!" Bay yelled. Jilly yanked the plastic bag out of his hand and tossed it toward the werewolf. "Now we can run." Theo didn't have to be told twice. He pivoted away from the park and took off, running across the street, toward the downtown area 3 blocks away. Behind him he heard Jilly and Bay's tennis shoes slap against the grass. The plastic bag rustled and was ripped apart. Theo counted the seconds by his pounding heartbeat. 5, 6, 7. The werewolf howled, and Theo knew the hamburgers hadn't distracted it long enough for them to get away. Chapter 11. Jilly quickly took the lead, outpacing both Theo's longer legs and Bay's staggering run. "Gotta get more exercise," Bay panted. "Shut up and run," Jilly shouted. "This way." She veered off the sidewalk into the yard between 2 houses, dodging prickly bushes half covered by the strange mist floating along the ground. Theo risked a glance over his shoulder and nearly tripped over his own feet. The werewolf had dropped to all fours and was chasing them. It was so close to Bay. Theo was surprised it hadn't pounced on his friend already. For his part, Bay was moving as fast as his legs would carry him. Maybe it hadn't been such a good idea to make him the bait. Jilly hissed. Get a move on, Theo. Theo kicked it into high gear and leapt over a low bed planted in pretty flowers. They just had to make it to the cinema's back door before the werewolf decided to tackle Bay and gobble him down for a late-night snack. Just 2 more blocks, Theo thought as he followed Jilly through darkened yards. Then 1 more block. Jilly was leading them toward the alley running around the cinema to Bay's family's house. Ahead, the cinema's tower appeared above the houses and businesses, its gargoyles a dull gray in the moonlight. The clouds had thickened, threatening to cover the moon. Already a thin finger-like cloud slid across the lower edge. Theo panicked. What would happen if clouds covered the moon? Would the werewolf get mad? Would it stop following them if it couldn't see? Or would it truly revert to its human form like the comic book said? Something clacked behind him and Bay yelped. Theo slowed enough so he could turn around and check on Bay and gulped hard. The werewolf had one hem of Bay's shorts snagged between its teeth. Bay had stopped running and was tugging on his shorts trying to get them loose. Let go, Wolfie, Bay cried. Jilly, Theo said. Problem? Oh, Jilly said. Drop your shorts, Bay. No way. I don't want you to see my boxers. Without thinking, Theo doubled back. A werewolf was not going to eat his friend. Bay stopped tugging on his shorts and waved his hands wildly at Theo, his eyes wide and scared. What are you doing, man? Run. Save yourself. By then Theo had reached them. Not knowing what else to do, he threw himself at the werewolf and caught it around the neck. Jilly gasped. Theo! Before the werewolf could shake him off, the night darkened abruptly. Theo glanced up. Clouds had completely covered the moon. The werewolf let go of Bay's shorts and stilled. Theo felt bones shifting in the werewolf's body. While they watched, the werewolf's hair slid off, its snout shortened into a nose, and its yellow eyes became human. Theo gasped and jerked away from the girl huddling on the ground, wearing a long tattered shirt. Winifred, he said. She pushed her curly hair away from her face. Her skin was red and splotchy, like she'd been crying, and her hands and bare feet were filthy. You know my name. Theo glanced at Bay, who was gazing open-mouthed at Winnie. To her he said, Jilly told me, when we saw you at lunch yesterday. I'm going to be in so much trouble, Winnie whispered. I'm supposed to stay in the house during the full moon. Never ever go out, Dad said, and now look at me. Jilly jogged over and knelt beside Winnie. You're the reason we're not supposed to go out at night, aren't you? Winnie nodded miserably. I'm not old enough to control the change yet. You can say that again, Bay muttered. Look at the holes in my shorts. Mom's gonna kill me. Winnie sniffed and buried her face in her hands. I'm so sorry. I just wanted to make friends like a normal kid. That's why I was at the theater the other day, to meet someone my own age. And then the movie moon made you turn, Bay said. Winnie nodded miserably. Theo knelt beside her and placed a hand on her shoulder. I understand. When Mom told me I had to stay with my grandparents for the summer, I was afraid I'd be all alone. Not such a great feeling, is it? Winnie shook her head. It's really hard making friends when you get hairy and growly for 3 days out of the month. Theo wanted to say more, but the area lightened, washing them all in a soft glow. He looked up and groaned. Clouds slid away from the moon, leaving it shining brighter than ever before. Oh no, Winnie said. A shudder ran through her and her limbs popped and shifted, elongating as fur grew out of her skin. Hide. I don't want to accidentally eat you. Jilly sprang forward and grabbed him and Bay by their arms. You heard her. Slowpokes. Do you want to be a snack or what? What about the plan? Bay cried. We're supposed to trap her. Winnie shook her head. Must hide. Can escape trap. Wait, Bay said, but Theo had heard enough. He shook off Jilly's hand and grabbed Bay's other arm. Between the two of them, he and Jilly hauled the other boy nearly all the way to the cinema's back door before another howl split the night air. Chapter 12. As part of his now foiled plan, Bay had propped the cinema's back door open with a brick so they could lead the werewolf to the trap inside. Good thing, Theo thought. That gave them a chance to escape now. Jilly reached the door and flung it open. Theo pushed Bay through behind her, then kicked the brick out of the way. The door banged shut behind him, followed immediately by Winnie Werewolf thudding into it. Jilly, Bay, and Theo stood just inside the door, hands on their knees, panting. Phew, Bay said. That was close. Too close, Jilly said grimly. Winnie Werewolf scratched at the door and whimpered. Then the noise stopped. Abruptly. After a beat, Theo said, Do you think she left for good? Jilly shook her head. She's probably looking for another way in. Bay's gaze swung to the curtain obscuring the remainder of the behind screen area from view. The front door's open. You guys were supposed to lead her in that way, remember? Jilly threw up her hands. Great. Come on. Maybe we can make it to the projector room before she figures out how to get in. The three of them hurried through the curtain and onto the stage. The area looked a lot like it had when Bay had brought Theo and Jilly there during the curse of the werewolf after the projector broke. Furniture was still scattered around the room and the mannequin still guarded the nearest wall. The biggest difference was the large net spread out in the dead center of the former stage, attached to a thick rope dangling from the ceiling. For long silver poles rested in a square under the net, and on top of it sat a plate of hot dogs. Theo looked at Bay. Hot dogs. Bay shrugged. What? I told you Dad cooked out tonight. Jilly rolled her eyes. We're going to get caught if we don't get a move on. Always in such a hurry, Bay muttered. You know she can't get to us back here. The back door's locked. Unless her paws develop opposable thumbs, she can't turn the interior door handle to get back here. Theo pointed dark red curtain covering the back of the screen. You sure she can't rip through that? Bay gulped. Yeah. Better shake a leg. Jilly scowled but didn't say anything, which surprised Theo. If ever anyone deserved to say I told you so, it was Jilly. A minute later they were in the theater proper. Bay had dimmed the overheads, leaving the room just light enough to see. The projector was on, shining a bright white cone of light at the screen, but no movie played. Whoops, Bay whispered. I meant to put the Curse of the Werewolf on before going to the park. Whatever for? Jilly said. Atmosphere. We'll probably have plenty of time to watch it, Theo said. Assuming we make it to the projector room before Winnie gets in. Bay placed a hand on his head and shifted his baseball cap. Good point. This way. He led them up the center aisle, his gaze darting right and left as if he expected Winnie Werewolf to be hiding between seat rows. The silence gave Theo the creeps. He'd never been in a room this dark outside of his bedroom back home. He'd for sure never been in a place so quiet he could hear his footsteps. He was used to night-long traffic and people arguing in the hallway outside their apartment. How did people stand a quiet so deep you could hear yourself breathe? They were nearly to the back of the room, near the doors leading into the lobby, when something banged ahead of them. That sounded like a door slamming shut, Bay whispered. Run, Jilly hissed. Bay took off at a run and burst through the open doors. The lobby was more brightly lit, though only just. Shadows darkened every corner, transforming ordinary objects into mysterious unknowns. Bay swerved toward the snack counter. This way. Jilly was hot on his heels, but Theo caught a shadow out of the corner of his eye and paused. Something hunched low in the shadows beyond an arcade game in the far corner. At first Theo thought it was outside the cinema, on the sidewalk. Then the shadow moved and stretched, and Winnie Werewolf's glowing yellow eyes appeared out of the darkness. She's inside, he cried. Panic nudged his legs into the fastest run he'd ever managed, so fast he nearly tripped over Jilly. She and Bay slipped into the door behind the snack counter and started running up a narrow flight of carpeted stairs, with Theo right behind them. Winnie Werewolf lunged toward the door, snarling, and leapt over the counter, landing at the bottom of the stairs with a thud. Hurry, Theo said. Going as fast as I can, Bay said. Then he reached the top and nearly fell through the door to the projector room. Jilly tripped over him and fell sprawling across him. Winnie Werewolf snapped her teeth together right behind Theo, and he gasped as he jumped the last stair and ran into the room. He grabbed the door's handle and swung it shut just as Winnie Werewolf made it to the landing and stuck her head into the room. The door hit her in the face. She growled and pushed hard, trying to muscle her way in, and Theo threw all his weight against the door. The door stopped, caught between them, neither closed nor fully open. Sweat broke out on Theo's forehead and he gritted his teeth. Winnie Werewolf pushed and the door slid open a crack. Gotta get this shut, he thought. Otherwise they were werewolf food. Jilly untangled herself from Bay, jumped up, and threw her weight against the door next to Theo. Then Bay stood up and leaned into it too, ever so slowly. The three of them forced the door closed. Bay reached over and locked it just as Winnie Werewolf threw herself against the other side. Phew, he said. Close call. Jilly scowled at him. You just had to catch a werewolf. Bay hung his head. Well, it sort of worked. Theo laughed and slid down the door until his bottom hit the floor. Yeah, it totally worked. That's why we're stuck in here until the moon sets. Bay grinned and hitched a thumb over his shoulder. We've got lots of movies we can watch. Jilly dropped down next to Theo. Now if we only had snacks. Bay walked over to the projector and lifted the lid of a nearby cooler. My friend, I've got you covered. Theo started laughing. He couldn't help it. After everything they'd been through, after all the glitches, at least they had snacks. Winnie Werewolf scratched gently at the door, but no one paid her any mind. The moon wouldn't set for hours. Until then they had movies to watch. Chapter 13. They fell asleep well before the credits rolled on The Curse of the Werewolf. Bay had insisted on watching it, arguing that they had all night. All night had turned into an hour. Then they'd nodded off one by one while Winnie Werewolf roamed the cinema. Later, Jilly woke Bay and Theo and showed them her watch. The moon set an hour ago. It's almost dawn. Bay stretched into a yawn. Do you think Winnie's turned back into a girl yet? Theo and Jilly exchanged a glance, then he shrugged. Probably. I mean, when the moon disappeared before she did, so why not now? Jilly squared her shoulders. Only one way to find out. She shooed Bay and Theo out of the way, twisted the lock and opened the door. There on the landing, curled up with her head resting on her arm, was Winnie. Every inch a girl. Theo didn't know he'd been holding his breath until he breathed out a sigh of relief. Let's wake her up. We need to get home before the grown-ups figure out we're not in bed asleep. Jilly knelt and gently shook Winnie. The other girl slowly blinked herself awake and sat up. Oh no, she said. Look. Deep scratches marred the door's shiny gray paint from top to bottom. Bay clapped his hands over his head and grimaced. Dad is going to be so mad when he sees that. He's going to be even madder if you don't get home, Jilly retorted. Winnie shook her head. Her curly hair swung madly around her face. And it's all my fault. I never should have left my room. We covered that already. Theo held out his hands and pulled her into a stand. Besides, it's not that bad. Me and Bay can probably repaint it in a couple of hours. Assuming we're not grounded until the end of eternity, Bay said glumly. Oh, stop, Jilly said. Let's walk Winnie home. Winnie looked shocked. Would you really, after everything I've done? Theo shrugged. It's not like you wanted to eat us, right? Winnie shook her head again, more slowly now. No, I really didn't. Jilly gently clapped Winnie's shoulder. There you go then. Bay adjusted his baseball cap. Yeah, but maybe you could have tried not to eat my shorts. Winnie bit her lower lip. I'm really sorry about that. Don't be, Bay said. Next time there's a full moon I won't go outside. Which none of them should have done, Theo thought. That didn't seem like a good thing to say right then, though. Winnie sighed and straightened her shoulders. I would be honored if you guys would walk me home, just to the edge of the park. Of course, Theo said. Grandma and Grandpa wouldn't be awake for another hour. So surely they had time to go that far before having to head home. Bay cut the projector off and stowed the movie reel, then the four of them set off for the park, winding through the chilly gray air and the mist swirling along the sidewalks. They walked in silence for a while, occasionally yawning as birds woke and chirped to each other. Halfway there, Winnie dropped her head, hiding her face behind a curtain of curly hair. I guess you guys want to know about the werewolf thing, huh? Theo was so curious he could have spit, but his mom had taught him better than to pry. Only if you want to talk about it. Yeah, Jilly said. We don't have to know. Bay scowled at them. You guys are no fun. Winnie smiled shyly at him. I thought tonight was a lot of fun. Fun and also scary. Theo never again wanted to be chased by anything off a basketball court. But I also think you deserve to know. Winnie took a deep breath and let it all out in a rush. My family was cursed a long time ago. We don't know exactly when or why anymore. We just know that the curse can't be broken. Every generation at least one of us carries the curse. We never know who, but I'm an only child, so it had to be me. Jilly laid a hand on Winnie's arm. That's so sad. Winnie shrugged. It's okay. We learned how to handle it early on. That's why we Moved here. Well, that's why my great-great-great-great-grandparents moved here, so we'd be safe and wouldn't hurt anyone. They were almost to the park by then. Theo could just make out Jilly's bike, where it leaned against the tree she'd been sitting under earlier that night. It felt like a lifetime ago when he'd met her and Bay here, when the werewolf had jumped out of the forest's edge and chased them to the cinema. Winnie, Bay and Jilly had discovered a new friend under the fur and sharp teeth. Finally, they stopped at the park's entrance and looked at each other. Well, Winnie said, this is it. Thanks for walking me back. Thanks for not eating us, Bay said. They all laughed, even Winnie. Jilly picked up her bike and pointed it in the direction of her house. See you guys later. Yeah, later, said Bay as he pivoted and hurried after her toward the cinema. Theo stared at Winnie for a minute. You sure you're okay? She smiled and turned her face into the rising sun, her eyes closed. Right as rain. See you around, Theodore Hessen. Later, Winifred Trodat. He waited until she disappeared into the tree line, then turned and headed for home. Theo snuck around the side of the house and eased the back door open, hoping not to wake his grandparents, then saw them sitting at the kitchen table holding steaming mugs. Well, Grandpa said, that must have been some night. Theo shut the door behind himself and tried really hard not to feel guilty. Hey, Grandpa, how'd you sleep? Grandma's mug hit the table hard enough to slosh coffee over the side. Don't. Even young man. You promised you would not go outside at night. Technically, he'd promised to be home before dark, but he sure wasn't going to say that out loud. Yes, ma'am, he said instead. And Grandma said, what were you doing? Theo thought about it for a minute. If he told them the whole truth, that would only get his friends in trouble. But what could he say that wouldn't be a lie? Finally, he settled on helping a friend. Grandma huffed out an exasperated sigh. Well, you're going to have to do better than that, Theo. Being out at night, breaking one of the few rules we set down for you, coming home at dawn. These are serious offenses, young man. I know, Grandma. I'm sorry. Sometimes sorry doesn't cut it. Grandpa's mustache twitched into a frown. Last night was the full moon, Tassa. Theo's grandparents shared a long look, then turned piercing gazes on him. Theo tried hard not to squirm. Rules are rules, Grandma said, though her voice was much softer now. I'm afraid we're going to have to ground you. Theo nodded. He'd expected that at the very least. And double chores for 2 weeks, Grandpa added. We'll work out the details after breakfast. Go up to your room and rest until then. Yes, sir. Theo walked over and gave each of them a hug, then started toward the stairs in his dad's old room. Just as he reached the bottom, he remembered something. What's the covenant? Grandma blanched. Where did you hear that word? He's not so young, Tassa, Grandpa said mildly. To Theo he said, it's nothing for you to worry about right now, young man. Now off to bed. Theo nodded and climbed the stairs, yawning. Whatever the covenant was, he'd figure it out with Bay, Jilly, and Winnie's help, assuming Grandma and Grandpa ever ungrounded him. He grinned as he entered his temporary bedroom and flopped down across the bed, fully clothed, already thinking of all the adventures he and his new friends could have during his visit to Deadwood Hollow.